Ceasefires feel like endings. The bombs stop, the markets climb, everybody exhales, and the news moves on to something else. That feeling is wrong, and today I'm going to show you exactly why. What happened on April 7th, 2026 deserves a closer look than it's getting. Trump posted on True Social, not at a press conference, not in a national address, but on True Social, that the United States and Iran had agreed to a 2-week truce. Hours before that post, he threatened to flatten every bridge and power plant in Iran if they didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Markets surged on the news. Oil collapsed more than 13% in a single session. Anchors smiled, commentators celebrated, and then Iran published their official response accepting the deal. And here's where you need to slow down and actually read what they wrote. Iran's Supreme National Security Council put it this way, and these are their exact words. It is emphasized that this does not signify the termination of the war. Our hands remain upon the trigger, and should the slightest error be committed by the enemy, it shall be met with full force. That is not surrender language. That is not even ceasefire language. A country that accepted defeat does not publish statements about keeping hands on triggers. Trump called it a total and complete victory. Iran called it a pause with weapons still loaded. One of those descriptions has to be wrong. And understanding which one takes us all the way back to June of last year. Less than 12 months ago, in June 2025, Israel launched what became known as the 12-day war. More than 200 Israeli fighter jets hit over 100 targets in a single morning. Nuclear facilities, military bases, command centers, all of it struck before most Iranians had finished breakfast. An operation code named Red Wedding killed 30 Iranian generals within minutes, along with 9 nuclear scientists. The United States joined on June 22nd, sending strikes into Natanz and Isfahan, the most fortified sites in Iran's nuclear program. 12 days after it started, a ceasefire landed on June 24th, brokered by the US and Qatar. Netanyahu called it a historic victory that would stand for generations. The ceasefire held, the world moved on, and this is where the story gets complicated because after June 2025, something unexpected started happening. Iran negotiated, indirect talks resumed, nuclear deal conversations picked up real momentum. By late February 2026, Omani mediators were telling people that a peace agreement was within reach, that Iran had agreed to stop stockpiling enriched uranium beyond the lowest possible level and to accept full IAEA verification. Diplomacy was working. On February 28, 2026, while those negotiations were still active, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strike didn't target a nuclear site. It targeted Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, killing him along with his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren, while simultaneously taking out 40 senior Iranian commanders and officials, including the defense minister, the IRGC chief, the naval commander, and the intelligence minister, all in the same morning. Analysts described it as the worst decapitation of a government's top leadership in Iran's modern history. The Omani mediators later noted that a peace deal had been within reach just before the strikes. The international crisis group's Ali Vaez described Khamenei as the most pragmatic decision-maker in the Iranian system, adding that his assassination potentially closes the door on nuclear diplomacy and empowers less predictable hardliners. 8 days after his death, the Assembly of Experts named his son Mojtaba Khamenei, 56 years old, as Iran's new supreme leader. And the IRGC pledged, in their own words, full obedience and self-sacrifice to him, vowing to fight until Iran achieved victory. Trump publicly declared Mojtaba unacceptable. He told ABC News directly, he's going to have to get approval from us. If he doesn't get approval from us, he's not going to last long. The Iranians selected him anyway. Now let's talk about what 40 days of this war actually produced, because most of the coverage has moved fast enough that the full picture hasn't landed yet. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz on March 4th, that narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, handled roughly 20% of the world's seaborne crude oil every single day. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years and kept climbing, reaching a peak of $126 compared to roughly $70 before the war began. The International Energy Agency called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history and described the disruption as larger than anything seen since the 1970s energy crisis. By March 31st, gas prices in the United States had hit $4 a gallon, a 30% surge driven almost entirely by the closure. Gulf states that import 80% of their food through the strait faced what officials described as a grocery supply emergency, with consumer prices in some areas spiking between 40 and 120%. Kuwait and Qatar, which generate 99% of their drinking water through desalination plants, stared down the possibility of a humanitarian water crisis. The human cost inside Iran reached at least 1,237 civilians dead in the first month, 452 of them women and children, with more than 24,000 people injured. 3.2 million Iranians were displaced, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. Lebanon's death toll from the parallel conflict with Hezbollah climbed past 1,400. 7 American soldiers died in the fighting, with 8 more seriously wounded. Pentagon costs reached $18 billion by March 19th, and the Defense Department submitted a request for an additional $200 billion. Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, which produces roughly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, took enough damage to cut its export capacity by 17%. Rebuilding the region's energy infrastructure, by Rystad Energy's estimate, could run past $25 billion. One more detail that deserves attention: a Financial Times investigation found that $580 million in bets on falling oil prices landed in the market just 15 minutes before Trump announced a pause in strikes on March 23rd. 15 minutes. That finding triggered formal calls for an insider trading investigation, and no public resolution has followed. Back to the ceasefire and to what it actually does and does not fix. Oil sitting at $94 a barrel after the announcement sounds like relief until you remember it was $70 before the war. Traders who use forward-looking futures contracts to price the next several months are not betting on a return to pre-war levels this year. The market is telling you it believes the ceasefire is real, but does not believe the problem is solved. And markets are often right about things like this. As of April 8th, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz hadn't meaningfully recovered. Iran was still vetting which ships could pass at roughly the same pace as during active hostilities. Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies on Earth, released a statement saying the ceasefire may create transit opportunities, but it does not yet provide full maritime certainty. When Maersk speaks carefully like that, the global supply chain listens. The gap between what each side wants out of permanent negotiations is enormous. Iran's 10-point proposal, the document Trump described as a workable basis on which to negotiate, demands that Washington accept Iran's uranium enrichment program and lift all sanctions. Israel's position demands Iran surrender its enriched uranium stockpiles. Those two demands don't overlap at any point. They aren't close to overlapping. And then there's the Lebanon contradiction, which nobody has resolved. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, who brokered this deal, announced publicly that the ceasefire covered all fronts, including Lebanon. Netanyahu said the same day that it does not cover Lebanon. Israeli strikes in Lebanon continued on the morning of April 8th, hours after the ceasefire was supposed to be in effect. Economist Justin Wolfers put it plainly: the economy doesn't just snap back. TD Bank strategist wrote that the market rally reflects a reduction in tail risks, not a material improvement in the underlying outlook. Pratibha Thakur of The Economist Intelligence Unit described what the world is watching as a pause in the conflict rather than any kind of lasting resolution, and called the arrangement very fragile. That assessment came from the same morning the markets were celebrating. Pull all of this together, and the shape of the situation becomes clear. The United States and Israel struck Iran while Iranian diplomats were sitting at a negotiating table. They killed the one Iranian leader most analysts consider capable of making and delivering a deal. His replacement, selected by Iran's own institutions, has been publicly declared unacceptable by the American president. The IRGC has pledged total war. Iran closed the world's most critical energy artery for 5 weeks, producing a global supply shock that economists are already warning will feed through to inflation, growth, and corporate earnings over the coming months. A ceasefire arrived under deadline pressure, and Iran's own acceptance statement explicitly said the war continues. 3 enormous problems sit completely unresolved. The nuclear question is untouched. The IAEA still lacks access to damaged sites, and neither side has agreed to what inspections would even look like under any future deal. Iran's new leadership remains, by American admission, unacceptable to Washington, which makes any lasting agreement structurally difficult to explain to domestic audiences on both sides. And analysts have raised the real possibility that Iran may permanently institutionalize some form of authority over Strait of Hormuz shipping, a constraint on global energy that simply didn't exist before February 28th. 2 weeks, that's the window. Delegations meet in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. Watch those talks. Watch whether tanker traffic actually normalizes or stays at the trickle it's been running at. Watch what happens in Lebanon, where Israeli strikes continued even after the ceasefire announcement. Watch what Mojtaba Khamenei, Iran's new supreme leader, says publicly in the days ahead. The guns are quiet for now, but Iran told the world in writing in their official government statement that the war has not ended and their hands are still on the trigger. The very least anyone watching this can do is take them at their word.